Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Profound Conversations. Today, we're going to be examining an issue related to reparations, and we'll take a look at HR 40. And just to give you a little bit of background before we have our profound conversationalists jump into this dialogue today, HR 40 was introduced in order to request that the issue of reparations be studied. And since the abolishment of slavery, there has been a number of things that have occurred in succession and overlapped that has resulted in the continued discrimination of African Americans. We've had sharecropping, we've had Jim Crow laws, there has been redlining, there's been discrimination in education, we've experienced mass incarceration there. And I don't know whether or not my numbers are up to date, but the numbers that I have is around 1 million African Americans that are incarcerated. Our unemployment rates, African American unemployment rates, pre-COVID 19 was twice that of white Americans, and it has gotten worse. We also represent, and again, pre-COVID 19, we have 1/16 of the wealth of white Americans. So what we have seen that since the abolishment of slavery, when we didn't get our 40 acres and a mule as promised, since that time, we have seen situations actually worsen for African Americans. It has not been getting better. And so this is a really critical issue, examining HR 40 and really taking a look at this whole issue of reparations. But before we jump into the issue of reparations, I want to introduce our profound conversationalists so that they can help kind of set the stage for where we are as African Americans today. What is the state of affairs? And we have with us Dayvon Love, and Dayvon is Baltimore based, and he is with a political organization and the director of public policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Also, we have with us Dr. Charles Lewis, and he is the director of Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy. So I set the stage for you, laid the foundation. All the while I was talking, Dayvon was nodding his head. So I'm going to ask Dayvon, jump right in there, Dayvon, and talk to us about where are we now as African Americans? What's the state of affairs? And tell us how that relates to the work that you do.
So first of all, I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to be on this platform to have this conversation. And I mean, your opening, as far as I'm concerned, is spot on in terms of I think one of the things that mainstream popular culture and policy spaces, when folks have conversations about chattel slavery, it is often talked about too much in moral terms. And while that's important, what you laid out are the economic residues of chattel slavery. One of the ways that I think it's best to describe it is that, chattel slavery was a 246-year head start for wealth accumulation of folks of European descent to build the kind of civic and political institutions to create a world dominated by systems that they control. And the only way to address that is to to engage policies that reverse the political economy of white supremacy that is fundamentally rooted in the looting and pillaging of the ability to engage in wealth acquisition activity that is central to building a foundation for developing institutions that can be responsive to the needs of our community. And I think a lot of times, given the messages we see in popular culture, I think there is the extent to which there are significant socioeconomic disadvantages that Black folks experience in this country is severely understated, right? So you said it. I mean, an average white family has 16 times the wealth of an average Black family. I remember being an intern at a policy organization, years ago that studied Maryland in particular. And a lot of the same data, unemployment 3 times higher for Black folks than white folks in Baltimore City. One of the, they said that because Maryland, has a, third of its population is Black. And they looked at zip codes with the same socioeconomic profile, but one majority Black, one majority white. And in the majority Black zip codes, property values are assessed at only 75% of that in white zip codes with the same socioeconomic profile. One of the most startling statistics that I remember looking at is that 47% of the wealth created, or 40% of the income of white folks in Maryland was generated off of assets that they own. Whereas for Black people, it's only 11% of our income was generated from assets that we own. So I think all of those things create a picture that makes the study of reparations important, because reparations, at least the way I see it, it's not just an abstract exercise of, helping to reconcile the sins of America. It's a very it's a demand that I think is essential for giving the investment in the institutions that are necessary and helping to reverse the damage that has been done by chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and all the other iterations of white supremacy.
Dr. Lewis, jump in.
Well, yeah, I agree with everything that's been said so far in terms of where we find ourselves as African Americans in the United States in the 21st century. And like as Dayvon has said, it's been a long process, to get to where we are. And obviously where we are is not where we need to be. And there has been a systematic effort, plan. It's not even a plan as much as it is. It's intrinsic in our country, in the sense that it goes on without anybody having to do anything. It's the fact that white people have more assets, stock market, and all that good stuff. That's a done deal, and so therefore, the accumulation of wealth that comes with that, it will just continue until something is done about it. And so, I think that the importance of this bill and this HR 40 is to take some concerted time and effort to try to figure out how do we begin to undo some of the racist forces and systems that are in place. Now, it's much easier said than done. All right, there's so many different places that has to be addressed in terms of education and healthcare and the workforce. all of these things have to be addressed. And there's no real simple solution to any of this. But I think at the at the end of the day, it will be an idea that really propels us to the next point in time. And that idea is that there's a couple of ideas. All right, there's an idea that is just and fair, that blacks should at least stop being mistreated, and then but it is to the advantage of the United States not only to stop mistreating us, but to build us up in order to build up the entire country.
Now, one of the things I noticed with the bill, one is to examine the issue around reparations, but it is also to look at an issue around apology. So it's two components of it. One is the economic, how do you address the economics? And then also the apology to African Americans. Do you think that an apology is necessary and that it has any benefits?
I think one of the fundamental questions that that what you raise poses is, what is Black people's relationship to the project and enterprise of the United States of America? And one of the things that I'm very clear about is that the Middle Passage, slave trade, the Maafa, was an unprovoked act of war against peoples of African descent. An unprovoked war, not just on us as a physical people, but on as a metaphysical attack on Black people, that our very existence in history was a part of the attack that levied against us. I say all that to say that I think there's some people that still have hope in the project of America delivering justice to Black people. And as Derek Bell, I think, has said best, racism is a permanent aspect of American society. It's not an aberration. It's not a mistake. It's not a flaw. It's central to the very mechanisms by which this society operates. So in terms of an apology, I just think that an apology, I think, assumes that we expect anything different. And I'm much more interested in getting back what's owed to us, as opposed to having the United States apologize for doing what is natural of it. And I just think it's important, that recognition, because I think, depending on your answer to this question about the role or the relationship that Black people had with this enterprise we call the United States, it determines the kinds of advocacy that we do. And I feel like there's too much conversation around folks asking this society to recognize the humanity of Black people. And I guess I'm just exhausted by that. I'd rather just build the institutions for us to be able to take care of ourselves and project the images that we want of ourselves, as opposed to asking this society to recognize us, in a way that it never has, and I just don't think ever will.
Now, one of the things when I think about this issue of reparations and the discussion gets to the economics of it, I think about that we've had times in history, despite all the forces that are designed to oppress people of African descent, we have managed to thrive. And you have, one of the most historical events was Black Wall Street. So we had an area that was thriving economically, and it received the attack of America. Burned down, people lost their homes, people lost their lives, And if we just fast forward, and I know our guests today are both based in Maryland. If we just fast forward and look at what has even occurred, we have Prince George County, for instance, which was one of the wealthiest counties and was heavily populated by African Americans that were then subjected to predatory lending. And so even those that acquired homes, then through predatory lending practices, lost those homes. So when we're talking about these issues around economics and what's old, what else needs to be put in place to ensure that even when we receive it, that we're able to retain it?
Unfortunately, we have to rely on the government to do its job, and that is to protect us like they protect any other American. Okay, the forces that destroyed Tulsa. If we look at Reconstruction and all the lessons that we learned about how African Americans made significant progress in a short amount of time, but all of it was wiped away because the the government abdicated its responsibility to protect us as citizens. Now, I can't. I don't know how we could say, well, we don't need the government. Unfortunately, we do, and so I think that we need to be we need to be aggressive and um, fighting for those rights that we do, that we have, that whether or not we are able to exercise them um, within the political arena.
Yeah, I agree. If I could add to that, I agree. I think I would say two things. I would say certainly what Dr. Lewis just said. And I think one of the things that is very important. I understand the issue of reparations as an issue of public policy, right? So it's an issue where it requires some understanding and muscle to be able to navigate the kind of legislative processes necessary and the mechanisms of government that would be necessary to operationalize such a policy. I would say the other thing that's important is I think as people of African descent, it's important for us to have an ecosystem of institutions that are self-sufficient and self-sustaining that can be the containers for the transfer of wealth that we're asking for. Because one of my concerns, now that reparations has gotten more popular, there are a variety of scholars who have made different kinds of arguments for reparations, right? So you have folks like, William Darity of Duke, Derek Hamilton, lots of folks that I think make good, sound social science arguments around the argument for reparations. But when it comes to the question of how to operationalize the policy itself, it is my concern that if we don't also focus on building the kind of ecosystem of institutions that Black people collectively own, control, and operate, then we will remain in a position of relative dependence on larger society's benevolence in order to sustain ourselves and our livelihoods. And so I think that part is going to be very important, and I think it's going to require investment in that work, because that's the kind of work that systems creation work that is not the work that most of people see. It's not the sexy part of making things happen, but it takes a lot of time and energy, and I think significant investment in building that infrastructure I think is necessary for reparations to really have a significant impact on our community.
Now, Dayvon, you have an interesting perspective on the benefit of having an organization that is not a 501c3. And I think that kind of goes to what you were talking about in terms of having these institutions that are self-sustaining, and not dependent on forces that may not have our best interests. So can you talk a little bit about that, about your organization and kind of your philosophy around that?
Absolutely. So me and my colleagues were fortunate to be kind of intellectually incubated in a space that is informed by the Black radical tradition. And as a result, in the activity of policy debate, many of us come out of the activity of policy debate. And for folks who are not familiar, policy debate is the most rigorous form of academic debate that exists, and many of the people that come out of the activity end up working in major public policy institutions. Think tanks that essentially set the agenda for what lawmakers do. And Karl Rove was a policy debater. Rumsfeld, like people who have had very powerful in the public policy arena. We came into the activity extending an intellectual and academic innovation in the activity, challenging the way that white supremacy and racism were part and parcel of the research methodology and policy approaches of the activity. And we were successful doing that. After we were finished with the activity, we founded an organization because we wanted to do that public policy advocacy work from kind of a, Pan-Africanist, Black self-determination focused perspective in the public policy arena, because we saw that in the Baltimore landscape that was sorely absent, that many of the organizations advocating for policy were not organizations of and from our community. We were clear that if we were a 501c3, a nonprofit organization, that we would be largely dependent on philanthropy. And philanthropy historically has had an interest in putting forward versions of advocacy for Black people that render us dependent on their institutions and see Black people primarily as recipients of social services. And not that that's bad, but to see us solely as recipients of social services and not as a people that can build the institutions for our own thriving and self-sustaining. We were clear that philanthropy was not going to fund an organization that would challenge that overarching dominant paradigm. And so we're an LLC, and we have kind of a social entrepreneurship approach to sustaining ourselves, which requires us to be able to meet the needs of our community, and to be able to. So we have what are called community sustainers. So right now we're at about 600 people or so who give us money once a month that support our work, that are mostly from our community. And that's important because there are things we get to say and do in public policy spaces that other people can't say because their funding would be impacted by it. And that's why to your point, that's why I'm so insistent about this importance in building like self-sustaining institutions and an ecosystem of institutions. Because when you look, for instance, at the human social service sector, right, public health, education, social work, there's an emerging recognition of the ineptitudes of the traditional approaches to these disciplines that are rooted in the fact that many of them don't have any regard for the technologies of human service that come out of African people's bodies of work. But these institutions their business model is profiteering off of Black suffering, and those who struggle against it within those institutions are often marginalized. And so I just say all that to say that I think my perspective on reparations and the importance of how the wealth is transferred and how we hold on to it is essential, because what I don't want is an environment where your traditional big box, white nonprofit, traditional social welfare bureaucrats are the ones that are administering services to our community that perpetuate, notions of our inherent pathology that keep our community, continually dependent. And so that's really, that helps really ground my perspective.
I mean, something as simple as Black-owned banks. I don't know the numbers offhand. I don't know if either one of you do, but I know we don't have that many of them around the country. So if you start even talking about the transferring of wealth, where does it end up? It doesn't end up in Black institutions, because we don't have enough of them around the country, and nor do we have representation in the primary banks, in terms of leadership positions.
And the resources to sustain the ones we have.
Right.
I think that's really key. Like, I think we have institutions, but they're competing against institutions that have way bigger budgets, and just a lot more resources.
Dr. Lewis, now your organization, are you doing anything around the advocacy around HR 40 or reparations?
Well, I think I'm not specifically to that particular bill, but I will definitely get behind it. And should the Democrats be successful in regaining the Senate, it increases its chances of passing. And so we got to develop a strategy to get it across the finish line.
Yes.
And that's what having worked on the Hill, that's the bottom line, right? You can have a bill introduced, and this bill has 158 co-sponsors, which is normally enough to get it to the floor of the House for a vote. So I don't doubt that it will, but given the climate that we're in and pressure that many of the legislators are under to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So they got to do something. And this is one of the things they can do, but we have to make them do it. Just like when Johnson conceded to Martin Luther King that he was going to introduce get the civil rights bill introduced. He told Martin Luther King, you got to make me do it. All right, meaning that I can't do it unless the pressure comes to bear on getting it done, which was beyond just his ability. You just couldn't walk in and tell Congress pass his bill, right? So, and we had a social worker in there too, Dayvon. Whitney M. Young Jr. was at the table with Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson to get those bills passed. And Whitney M. Young's his piece of that was he had a relationship with a lot of the corporate leaders, and he took a lot of heat for that too, because he was talking to them. But because of his relationship with those guys, they were able to get the bill passed. Long story short. So, I agree with everything Dayvon's saying, all right? But it's not like we never heard this, Dayvon, all right? We've been saying this for a long time. And it's true. And it's no less true now than it was, back in the day when other people were saying it, when the boys were saying it and everybody. Yeah, we need to pay attention to our own institutions and value them and build them. But still, we're in this country, all right? We're affected by this country, and there's no way we can really separate ourselves from that. We could talk about how much we should be rendering up unto Caesar, but the thing is, we pay a lot of taxes, okay? All of us and we should get our return on those taxes. I'm sorry, we should be, we got to demand this. One area of reparations that about a lot is education. All right, that one way to undo the damage that has been done to our people over time by the failure to educate us. And it was a deliberate, decision not to educate Black people. It was a crime in the South to teach a slave or a Black person to read. So this has been an extenuation of that whole idea. Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro. So what I'm saying is that we gotta have a system to educate our kids. I mean, all of them, not just the few who go to charter school. We can build charter schools, and that's a good thing. But we're not going to educate the masses of our kids just through charter school. So I'm saying we have to demand changes. All right, one change we have to have is how education is financed in this country, um, because if we continue to finance education through property taxes, then we're always going to have an unequal and an unfair system.
Mm. Yeah, so if I can add, I mean, so I would say a couple of things. One is that I agree, and I think, and I don't know if there's perceived tension between the idea that we have as a community institutions that anchor our civic, political, and economic activity, while simultaneously navigating the current systems that impact our lives. Right, like a lot of the work that LBS does, we do a lot of work around like criminal justice advocacy. So we're involved in, addressing the pretrial system and making it so that instead of, when folks are charged for a crime, instead of having to pay bails they can't afford, like requiring the Court of Appeals requiring that that commissioners exhaust all non-financial conditions for release before making someone pay a bail, and if they have to pay a bail they can afford, things around, community oversight of law enforcement. So I think those things are complementary to each other. And even to the point about education, that it's very important for us to be involved in policy as it relates to how education is administered. I guess the only thing I would add, and this is one of the conundrums that I find myself in and having conversations about this, is that Maryland is a very democratic state. Like we have a Democratic Party supermajority in our state legislature and a very big public sector. So the kind of narrative about Maryland is that it's a very progressive state, right? But a part of what happens is that progressives, while advocating on issues around socioeconomic inequalities, many of the institutions that get tasked with operationalizing the programs that actually serve our communities, in many respects, the architects of that are folks that engage in the dehumanization of Black people. And one of my major concerns, even about the nature of how the kind of mainstream ed reform movement is situated currently, it's a mostly white-led movement and when you talk about the actual expertise around human socialization of children of African descent in this particular context, many of the kind of mainstream leaders of the ed reform movement are folks that have no understanding, no idea about the particulars that's in terms of what's necessary to create an educational experience that would actually be liberatory for the young people that come through many of these institutions. And so I think a part of, at least for me, when I think of reparations, providing the resources so that we can put in place thought leadership that can sustain itself off of helping to design the institutions and the systems that serve our community, so that it isn't a replication of of many of the toxicity of much of the traditional elements of the industries that are tasked with serving our community. And for me, that's just so big, because even here in Baltimore, and in the state of Maryland, I see so much advocacy about more funding for education, more social services, but a lot of this stuff is run by folks that are actually doing our community more harm than good.
Let me just say one thing before you so you're right, man, that progressives talk a lot, and but at the end of the day, man, there are a lot of progressives, including brothers and sisters, right, who are comfortable. All right, and they got the jobs, they got the positions, but they don't make the changes that are necessary in order to change the system, because they don't want to quote unquote rock the boat, because when you rock the boat, there's a chance. And the politicians are the worst, man. Like those guys get in. Once they get in, they want to be elected every time, and they won't do anything that's gonna jeopardize, their opportunity for election. All right, so so in order to get transformational results, you've got to have some kind of revolutionary ideas, okay? Because if we keep doing the same thing over and over, expecting the same results, as they say, that's the definition of lunacy, right? So we got to do something different, right? So one of the things for me is we got to change the way we elect people to office, so that we can get better people in those offices who are going to be willing to do the things that are necessary to make change. Because when people get into Congress, they play the same game. They raise the money, just like everybody else. I mean, once you'll have Congress people, that will speak out on issues that others may not. But in terms of being willing to, just few who are willing to jeopardize their place in the system to really challenge the system.
So let me ask you, because we got this, the bill is asking for a commission.
Right.
One of the questions that we have that came across is who's best qualified to sit on this commission? So I'm looking at, this is supposed to be a 13-member commission, and 3 people of that commission is going to be appointed by the president. You got 3 members that would be appointed by the Speaker of the House, 1 member appointed by the Senate, and then there are 6 other spaces. And I'm going to read what it says. It says 6 members shall be selected from the major civil society and reparations organizations that have historically championed the cause of reparation justice. So the first question is, do you think that's a good makeup of this commission? And is there someone in particular that you think should be sitting on this commission?
Yeah, it's I'm trying to think of the sister's name. I saw her the other day in a conversation with Skip Gates and Eric Foner at Columbia, and the president of Columbia, talking about Reconstruction. She's the executive director of the African-American Policy Forum. Somebody look that up for me quickly.
Angela Glover.
No. African-American Policy Forum.
Or is that Kimberly Crenshaw?
Yes, absolutely. If I had to pick one person, she would be on the commission. Now, as far as the speaker picking 3 people, all right. I mean, we got to tell the speaker who those 3 people should be. You're not going to leave it up to, if let's say it's Nancy Pelosi to pick 3 people. You know what I'm saying? We have to. No, we really have to be engaged, man. We have to be really engaged. We can't, if the bill passed, we can't say yay, and then leave it up to the mechanisms of the. We still have to stay really, really engaged, and we have to vet those people going onto that commission. And if we see people going onto the commission that should not be on that commission for any reason, we have to challenge them.
Okay, so
I think I'm saying this, Linda, that there is going to be a lot of competition, a lot of different ideas about who should be on the commission, but we should have some kind of way of making sure that the right people are on the commission.
I want to acknowledge Judge El-Amin, who joined us. And I know Judge El-Amin is very passionate about HR 40. So I'm going to ask you to join the conversation. We've been talking a lot about reparations, the need for reparations, and just, the feasibility of this bill and what we should look to get out of it should it pass. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Judge, and let you kind of jump in here.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. Good afternoon, fellow panelists and viewers. Assalamu alaikum. May God's peace be with you. And I would say that I need you to accept that, because that's the only way, especially Brother Kareem Ali, is going to be at peace for my tardiness in this, in having joined you. I mistakenly calendared this at 5. I ran an errand thinking I could be back, but it was 4, so I apologize. Please accept those apologies. That said, I ran across something very encouraging just yesterday in the October 16th issue of the Muslim Journal, our community's newspaper, wherein they reported on the reparations bill that had been signed by California's governor, who is Gavin Newsom. Yes, he signed it. I haven't had a look at it, but basically, I think it patterns HR 40 in that it establishes a commission to investigate and prescribe exactly what should be the components of reparations. This is in California, a relatively progressive state. But I think this is a great bellwether for the reparations movement. And California, takes the lead in many things, and this is one. So it behooves us to study that and delve into it further. But you may have already said, and already may have been discussed, that I arrived at the point of focusing on reparations because I didn't want to get bogged down in all of the side arguments. For those of our Bible studying brothers and sisters, it's like, America, you must be born again. You got to enter the womb and come out with a new dispensation. And the only way to do that is to acknowledge the African-American at the window. That's where we are. We need supplied with focus. We need education. We need land. We need money. We need identity. We need so many things. We need psychological rebuilding. We need new criminal justice orientation. We need scholarships. We need so much. We need our 40 acres and a mule and then some. And remember what Harriet Tubman famously said, as quoted by Ariesa Shabazz in her book, if I could have convinced more slaves that they were slaves, I could have saved thousands more. So part of our problem is that we don't know how deep our problem is. And the commission that is empowered, and I agree with what I heard Charles Lewis saying, we have to watch who's on there. We have to lobby, and we have to be active as to who is going to get on the reparations commission when that bill does pass, because there are going to be some self-styled, reactionaries, and people are afraid of that. People are afraid of making white folks mad, but we got to stop being afraid of making white folks mad. We got to make ourselves whole. And those sincere Caucasians, be they of Italian, Jewish, Mexican, American, Latino origin, they are going to be joining with us, because when America solves the problem of its quote unquote former Negro slaves, America will have exorcised this pathological and cancerous source from its body, and that's what's needed. So that's sort of my intro, and we can take it from there, Linda, in terms of more specifics and so forth. But since I missed out on some of the dialogue, I hesitate to cover ground that's already been on which light has already been shed.
Well, we do know that we have to have, we know we have to have you back. Well, we can get you in for the full hour. We have about 10 more minutes, and we do have a couple of questions. So, Kareem, do you want me to ask the questions, or do you want to jump on with the questions?
Sure, I'll ask the questions. It might be a little bit easier. Thank you, Judge, for all that you did to get back. So she asked a question about who would be most qualified. I had a question, and I want to ask Dr. Lewis. You had a program at the Press Club, I believe it was last year, where you brought on some thought leaders, and they were talking specifically about the 529 savings account for children, for young students. Do you think that would be one of the areas that should be first considered funded through a reparations agreement that the 529 students? And in that instance, I recall the gentleman speaking of all students across the board, whether they be Black, white, people of color, what have you. What are your thoughts around that? Because and it goes to the how of dispensing of these resources.
Right. So this is a plan where every child will be given a $500 savings account at birth. And then depending on their socioeconomic status, they can build that account. Kids in low-income households and low-income families can get tax free. They could do tax-free contributions to these accounts. And as and it's a stratified system. So the more you make, the less you can, the less benefits you get in terms of tax-free benefits in terms of building these accounts. And so it's a way to guarantee that future generations do not grow up without assets. And it will disproportionately benefit people of color because we're disproportionately in that lower income strata. I think it's. I don't want to spend too much time on should have been, would have been, right? But we missed some real big opportunities on that Supreme Court, and it's going to cost us because as long as we got a conservative Supreme Court, they're not going to allow. There will be no allowance for undoing discrimination. So we're going to have to be, we're going to have to deal with that and try to figure out policies that will disproportionately benefit African Americans, although not solely.
Yeah, another question came up, and this may be for Dayvon. I mean, you've got thought out there that, hey, monies or resources that would come from reparations really are not due to people of today. That's money actually that would have been owed to people that were actually enslaved, right? And you've got different thoughts around what reparations should actually look like. So my question to you is as you think about what actually should be developed, for Black people in America, do you think that the contract, with Black America that has been sort of co-signed by Ice Cube and initiatives like that speak more directly to what actually is needed? And what are some of the initiatives that you would want to see come out of this effort?
I'll say three quick things. One is wealth is generational. Wealth doesn't exist merely in the confines of, one individual person. And as, societies require social relations are deeply impacted by wealth. Who you hang out with has impacts on your access to resources. So when people say folks today, it really should be people who are enslaved that should get the resources. As descendants of those who were enslaved, and as people of African descent, we are recovering what was lost. Second is you mentioned like the contract for American Ice Cube. There have been lots of plans, lots of documents over many years, good plans on a lot of these questions of addressing the issue, particularly issues of wealth and a variety of other issues. In my own kind of study of history, what I think has been the challenge, one of the central challenges, is our ability to develop the infrastructure to operationalize the plans in a way that is sustainable beyond particular moments. Like I think part of the issue is that there are moments that come around, and we work within the confines of those moments, and those moments never last as long as we need for us to be able to operationalize the solutions that these plans speak to. And then lastly, I would say that one of the ways, for instance, as we think about reparations, and I think there are a variety of ways to think about how it should be actually done. I'm interested in Black folks having conversations about like, what industries do we want, right? Because I think a lot of times we talk in terms of just dollars, right? But I think we should talk about what industries do we want, and I mentioned the human social service sector before, which includes education, social work, et cetera. To me, those are industries that should belong to us, primarily because we're most of the people being served by those industries, right? So I think we should talk in terms of we want that industry. Same thing about marijuana, right? Marijuana is being legalized all over the place, but it's white folks that are the ones benefiting from it. So we should start talking about what industries do we want that rightfully belong to us, that will outlive just the transaction of giving us what we are owed.
And thank you. And lastly, this is for Judge Hassan. And you can look at this from the perspective of all the years on the bench, and you've seen, many people come before you, and I wouldn't hesitate to say that many of them are African-American people in our community. Can you talk a little bit about, so that we don't step over this, the condition that we're in as a people today, and why this is such an important issue? And something you had said to me before is it's not about us getting money. Of course, we need money, and yeah, it may take trillions of dollars to get us there, but it's not about that. Can you, sort of just, and that'll bring us to close to the close of the program, but I don't want to step over the condition that we're in today that requires that this conversation be taken seriously.
Well, thank you, Brother Kareem. One of the seminal questions is, why do we act like we do? To me, the answer is many of us don't know who we are. We have this sort of general idea of where we came from, but one of the things I would love to see, in addition to an educational plank, a very strong educational plank, or as a part of that, is I think we should be funded the so-called right of return. We now can access our DNA, and I believe that every African American should be allowed the wherewithal, be given a DNA test and round trip tickets, plus a couple of weeks worth of money for us to visit our ancestral homes in Africa through African ancestry DNA, not the other ancestry DNA, but there's a company called African Ancestry DNA. They can't advertise on TV like Ancestry.com can. This is African Ancestry. So I happen to have done my DNA, and my wife as well. And there is the Sierra Leone and the Mandinka connection. But I was very surprised. On my dad's side, he comes from the Mbundu people of Angola. Mbundo was the tribe to which the great Queen Nzinga belonged. I want to be able to go there. I want to see my ancestors. I want to be able to have an interpreter there to see who looks like me. Do I see some distant cousin? I mean, we need to be able to link up so we can physically identify with who we are, and that'll help us morally and spiritually identify with who we are. Of course, we know we're children of God and all that other stuff, but you know, let's get down to they stole us, took us over here across the water. Now we want to go through the door of no return and return and then come back with a better sense of self. So, Brother Kareem, the answer to that question is we don't know who we are. If we knew who we were, we'd be a lot better off. There's no people in the world that has been totally separate from their roots. And we just are very, I mean, it's only by the province of the divine power of God, Allah, that we can even function. But if you sat us down collectively on the psychiatrist's couch, the psychiatrist would say, well, here's some drugs, man, because that's the only way you're going to make it. Because you don't even know who you are. And that's what we've done. I heard what you said, Dayvon, about industry. Of course, yeah, the marijuana industry is there, and shamefully, we didn't get any concessions, and that I blame the Black Legislative Caucus for that. Terrible miscue, but you know, we certainly can do better than we've got the entertainment industry where we do all the show and very little of the business. I mean, look at what I'm trying to think of the stellar Taylor Swift. Look at the money she's amassed because of her control of her own product. We got more rappers doing that now, but come on, there's entertainment, there's sports. You know, from Magic Johnson to the brother who owns part of the Michael Jordan, all Tiger Woods should have. So we've got so much talent, but we need that infrastructure, as you say, to be able to harness it. But identity is a big issue, Kareem.
Right.
Yeah, Linda, you can close on. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're at the top of the hour, and I want to thank all of our profound conversationalists. I think this conversation today could have sped off in a lot of different directions. And so this gives us some food for thought as we plan some of the episodes coming forward. And certainly, Judge, we most definitely want to get you back again to get a full hour in. So let's just consider this a teaser so that we can think about how our next conversation. And
a few acknowledgments before we do close out. The program Profound Conversations, executive produced by Muslim Life Planning Institute, media expression and production by Leah Network, webinar technical logistics produced by Erica Christie, Khadija Ali, graphics and animation design Cafe. Today's host is Linda Howard, CEO of Alternative. And obviously today's guest, and I thank you, Dr. Charles Lewis from the Congressional Research Institute, help me for policy.
Social work and policy.
Social work and policy, Mr. Dayvon Love, public policy with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and Judge Hassan El-Amin, retired Prince George's County Circuit Court Judge. I want to thank everyone again. Without you, there would be no programming. So tune in next week, same time, same bat channel. Thank you, Linda. You can close out. Thank you.
I think you've done it. So thanks everyone for joining, and join us next week for the next Profound Conversation.
Right. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Keep up the good work.